Okay, so welcome to this. I'm going to do a short video on just an introduction to the state and social contract theory section of this course. As I'm sure you know from my emails, I'm having a little bit of difficulty getting internet. So I'm recording these videos and then walking them over to campus and uploading them. I'm sure things will be back to normal soon. I appreciate your cooperation. Um, so to start off, let me just say a little bit about the entire section, give you a little bit of an overview of what the major questions are and the motivations behind the way this section of the course is structured. um, I'll go through some of these questions at the beginning of the section. Just to remind you, every one of these sections of your reader begins with a series of questions that have been kind of carefully composed to guide you through the reading. Um, and so a good test of whether you understand the material after you're done reading is whether you can answer these questions. So always maybe after the section, after you're finished reading it, after we're finished talking about it, maybe go back to some of these questions. It's a good way of assessing whether you've learned it or not. So we're going to read three different authors in this section. Thomas Hobbes, as you can see, perhaps some of you have heard of Hobbes before, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This is a very regular section of a lot of courses that you could take at the university would have these three authors together. If you Google or you search for a YouTube video, I'm sure you'll find some videos that address Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau all in the same lecture. There are reasons for that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what I wanted to say is, first of all, the way we look at these three authors in this course is, however, quite different from what you will find in regular courses, even in regular videos or whatever about all three of these figures. That's because we are approaching from the standpoint of the text that we read before. In particular, we've read texts that are in the early modern development of science, Copernicus, also Alexander Pope and Bruno, and these authors not only explain the kind of new cosmological, astronomical worldview of the period, but also kind of interpret it for its humanistic significance. Now, in Copernicus, in Bruno, and in others, we saw one of the key ideas was that the new conception of the cosmos was built on a new conception of system, of systematic order, of systematicity, of what it means to be a system, and therefore what it means to be orderly, regular, beautiful. As I once stressed earlier in this course, the medieval worldview was very regular. It was very ordered and structured and systematic from its own point of view. The way the universe was understood, with the Earth at the center and heavy things going towards the middle, also was very systematically easily relatable to the Christian worldview. And so that was systematic in its own way. But when people like Copernicus and Bruno and others looked at that system, they didn't see a system at all, as we've seen. Copernicus saw a monster. Bruno saw a prison, right? Nothing beautiful there. Something opposed to human creativity, freedom, value. We also, when we read the poem by Alexander Pope, we saw that in the three parts of the poem, the first part sounded very much like it could be growing out of Copernicus and Bruno, because it was all about the system of the universe, and there was even some cosmological and astronomical imagery of the planets, in their order around the sun and so on. But in the subsequent parts of that poem had four parts. The first part was about the system in general, and then the second part was about the system within man himself. So it took, in a way, that same scientifically motivated, cosmological, astronomical system, that notion of systematicity, and tried to find a kind of microcosm version of that within the structure of the human psyche, the human mind, the human body itself. And we saw that in Pope talking about the interplay between the two forces of self-love or passion and reason. In the third part of that poem, he then extended that idea of system, to cover government itself. And this is where we come into contact with what's going on in Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. In that third part, what Pope argued was that there is a kind of systematic order in things which we should mimic in our forming governments, right? And this has a lot of the structure and the order and the harmony, perfection of a governmental system, of a political system, is in many ways a mirror image of the cosmological system in terms of what it means to be ordered. It's not ordered by an external principle, it's ordered by an internal principle. What is the best government? It's the best functioning government. It's the most orderly, interconnected government. It's the one that serves the people the most. In terms of being immanent, remember Copernicus didn't get his theory from revelation. He got his theory from observing the cosmos and simply coming up with the model that best fit, in his view, not only the data, but his conception of what a good or perfect system should be. Similarly, in almost an exactly parallel way, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau will look at society, at human beings, and they will look at the fact that just as Copernicus looked up at the astronomical world and saw that it was composed of the planets, and he looked for the best structure and order among the planets, so Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau will say the government or the political body is made up of people. Right? What is the best ordering and systematic structure in which those people can live? That's the question that underlies all of their texts. What is the correct system? Of course, because they're not they're not considering politics for the first time. Absolutely not. They're reviving, in fact, a lot of the ancient texts from the Greeks and so on, political texts. One of Hobbes's first things that he did in his life was translate Thucydides' Histories of the Peloponnesian Wars, which is full of political theory. Some of you may have read some of it in 201, perhaps. They didn't come up with anything absolutely new. They revived old theories, but by comparison with what was present in the medieval period, the predominant theory then was one of the divine right of kings. Kings have their right, so do nobles and higher families, in some respect because it is given to them by God. Not necessarily directly, but perhaps through history it's been handed down. That was the traditional source of political power in medieval Europe. So the king was in a certain way the earthly power of God on earth, right? Whereas the Pope was the spiritual power, or the symbol of the spiritual power of God on earth. So all three of these thinkers, since they're rejecting that authority of the previous models, and they're looking for a new source of political power and justification for political power, they of course want to find ways or reasons for rejecting that traditional view. As you're going through, you should also think about how this is also present in this kind of move, but not political, in science, is present in Bacon and Descartes, of course. Rejection of past theories, creating a new system, and so on. Now, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau naturally looked to that cosmological tradition and to those models of science that were put forward by people like Descartes and Bacon to try to build their political theories, right? Hobbes in particular, Hobbes is a very interesting case. On the one hand, he lived about the same time as Descartes. In fact, they corresponded. One of Descartes' early or middle books, the Discourse on the Method, he sent copies of it to Thomas Hobbes so that Hobbes could criticize it, and he responded to Hobbes. Now, Hobbes is a completely different kind of thinker than Descartes, and so they they absolutely detested one another. Their correspondence is quite humorous because they essentially just insult one another. Hobbes says, well, Descartes thinks this, but everything he says is nonsense, so we shouldn't even be talking about it. And Descartes says the same thing in return to Hobbes. Nevertheless, Hobbes, in terms of his understanding of method, is very, very similar, or is in some ways very similar to Descartes. He is not a normal empiricist in the Baconian sense. His political theory is supposed to be a deductive system. Remember deduction in Descartes. So he's going to start with first principles and derive the correct political system from those principles. I'll talk a little bit more about those principles in a moment. But Hobbes is definitely a deductive thinker. Locke, on the other hand, is a famous empiricist, although some of his political theory is not particularly empiricistic. And he argues with Hobbes, of course, about fundamental concepts and ideas. And Rousseau will do the same thing. But what they all share is an attempt to kind of mimic and extend the method of physics and whatever the proper method for science is, into the realm of political theory. In fact, throughout this whole course, we see kind of the seed of the idea of systematicity and its relationship to science, and we see that gradually extended to all other domains of human activity. Here we see this in political theory. Of course, those two things are related, science and system, because the presupposition of modern science is that when you carry out your method, the world is going to end up being a structured, orderly thing that you can know, right? That's not obvious. That's a belief. We saw this in Pope, for instance. The belief that the world is ultimately a system motivates us to think that if we have the right method, we can discover that system. If you don't believe there's such a system there, which is equivalent to what the Pope was thinking, because he thought God could do whatever he liked, so the system there is not really a system, it's simply the desire, whatever God happens to want, then you shouldn't expect things to be interconnected in a beautiful, harmonious way, right? But all of these thinkers, of course, dead in early modern science, and that's part of what made early modern science possible, was this belief that the universe itself is a system and therefore is amenable to scientific methods of study. Okay, so let's look at just a little bit at some of these preliminary questions. So for instance, what is a social contract? Throughout this section, you should maybe make a note card or something, or at least mark every time you run into certain terms, because they will be defined differently by the different authors. And that is the point of connection and comparison that we want to really focus on in this section. So, for instance, the concept of a social contract, all three, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, will discuss the idea of a social contract, which is also sometimes called a compact, or what does Hobbes call it? A covenant, right? They'll all discuss this idea, but as with many other terms in this section, you'll find that they mean something completely different by it than the other authors do. So they will define, and some of them will then redefine what these terms mean. And why? Because these are the fundamental principles they'll use to build up their political theory. And so fixing the real meanings and definitions of these terms is the most important, basic, fundamental step they take. And then they try to derive from them various consequences. So what is a social contract? Well, very briefly, this idea had been around since the ancients. It's found in, some version of it is found in Plato, some versions of it is found in Thucydides. It's the idea that somehow the basis of political power is that human beings come together and make an agreement to hand that power, their own power, over to someone else in the state, some special class or group of people or an individual, who then has exclusive right to, for instance, judge matters in a court of law. We do this, right? You and I, implicitly or explicitly agree when we're in a modern society that we will allow judges, special individuals given that job, to determine, for instance, whether I owe you money or you owe me money, or whether I deserve punishment because I violated your rights, or whatever. I don't decide that. You don't decide that. We designate a third party to do that for us because that seems to be the most convenient way, and that third party is not partisan to, or shouldn't be partisan towards me or towards you. They should be fair, right? Well, the social contract is the idea of handing over certain duties or rights to the state, punishment, creating laws, and so on, and that we as citizens make that agreement somehow. Now, that agreement may be a real agreement, an actual agreement, where people come together and actually form a contract, or it can, as is the case in some of these authors, a implicit agreement. So it's like a fictional agreement. You might say it's kind of like, in this respect, the force of inertia or something in physics. It's not, no body, the force inertia says that a body will continue in its state of motion infinitely unless something stops it, right? Of course, anything you start in the universe is eventually going to hit something. It's going to slow down. Other things are going to come into contact with it. There is no true body traveling under inertia and no other forces. So in a way, that notion of inertia is a kind of fictional idealization. So also sometimes this idea of a social contract is used in that way, as a theoretical construct, an abstraction that helps us to analyze and to understand the basis of political theories. So we'll see. We'll get more into that. What is a social contract? Do societies, even modern ones, really seek out the consent of their members? You may notice they don't. But still, this is a powerful idea. Is the state of nature a thought experiment or a realistic depiction of original society and human nature? Here, state of nature is another one of these terms. You'll see it straight off in Hobbes, a state of nature. He'll define what a state of nature is. I can tell you in all authors, a state of nature, nominally, or just in terms of the words, designates a state, not a political state, not a social state, but the condition that we are in before any government is formed. That's what a state of nature is. Now, what really the state of nature is for us as human beings, or was, or whether it truly existed, that is a whole other set of questions. The meaning of the term is the condition we are in before a government is created. You'll see in Hobbes, in a state of nature, there are no laws. You can't do anything wrong in a state of nature because there are no laws, so there's no good or evil. Whereas when you get to Locke, he will argue that already in a state of nature there are laws, and there is good and evil. So they'll disagree about what that state is like. Just don't be tricked by the term state. It means a condition, not a state, actually. This is important because you'll see this gets very confusing very soon. Let's see. Okay, here's another one. When we get to Thomas Hobbes, the first author, what is Hobbes's view of the nature of equality between human beings in the state of nature? Equality is another one of those terms you're going to have to pay very close attention to and define for each of the writers. Hobbes, I won't tell you straight off what Hobbes thinks equality is. That'll be an interesting question to ask, but pay attention to this. And I'll tell you what he means by equality is absolutely different from what Locke believes equality is. That's another one of those terms. Let's see where there's one thing I want to talk about here. Right of nature, that's another one of those. Freedom and liberty, it's another term you should write down and pay attention to throughout all the authors. Now here's the one I was looking for. Laws of nature. You might think from the words involved that the laws of nature are the laws that are present in a state of nature, right? that would be far too simple. Remember, a state of nature is the condition before there is a state, before there is a government. The laws of nature are the laws that ought to rule in a state or in a social condition, right? Not in the state of nature. I mean, we'll have to tweak this just a little bit, but that is here laws of nature. Nature does not refer to the state of nature. It means these laws stem from nature, right? This is why these are not artificial laws. These are not arbitrary or what's sometimes called positive laws. These are laws that stem from our nature as human beings, perhaps, or from the state, the nature of society itself, or the nature of government, right? Not from the state of nature. The state of nature may be in violation of these laws, right? We'll see. Okay, and then Locke and Rousseau. Okay, now I want to say, well, let me finish this video, and then I'll start the next video just talking directly about Thomas Hobbes himself. So, see you in the next video.